At the time I'm recording this video, we are a couple of weeks away from the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2. And while most Nintendo fans are busy discussing things like the exorbitant price hikes, the terrible pre-order situation, or even the EULA update where Nintendo said they can remotely brick your console if they suspect you of using mods. Over here in the Fire Emblem community, there's only one question on everyone's lips. Will the Switch 2 finally give us the long-awaited FE4 remake? You see, for almost a decade, there have been leaks, rumors, and whispers suggesting an HD version of Genealogy is just on the horizon. And in absence of any official confirmation or denial from Nintendo, the fanbase has taken it upon themselves to read the proverbial tea leaves, or sometimes just meme the idea of an FE4 remake into oblivion. In fact, the status a Genealogy remake has as a meme in the community makes it pretty difficult to parse just how serious people are being when pointing to evidence or leaks that we are getting one soon. Especially since some segments of the community seem to have developed Silksong syndrome, unironically pointing to things like Heroes not having an FE4 banner, Path of Radiance getting ported to the Switch 2 NSO, or even the Nintendo News app featuring Fire Emblem as one of the series you can get updates on as definitive proof that FE4 is coming. Just wait, guys. I swear it's coming. It's coming. As for where I stand in the Great Genealogy debate, I would describe myself as a doubter. I don't find any of the leaks or rumors to be credible, nor the other so-called evidence people point to. Don't get me wrong, I don't claim to have any sort of special insight into Nintendo's plans, so it's very possible that they are working on an FE4 remake, but to my mind, it's just as possible that they're working on an FE6 remake, an FE7 remake, or no remakes whatsoever. So in this video, I want to go over all of the evidence people point to for a potential FE4 remake, and why I find it unconvincing. I won't be trying to present any counter-evidence to prove there's no FE4 remake, simply because proving a negative is a functional impossibility. But I hope by the end of this video, even if you disagree with me, you can understand where my perspective comes from. And maybe, just maybe, this will encourage people to approach rumors of confirmed FE4 remakes OMG Lex HD with a little bit more skepticism. I'll tackle the evidence in order from least convincing to most convincing, so we're going to start with some of the more absurd ones. The territory where you can't tell if it's just someone memeing or if there are people who genuinely believe this stuff. And by far the least convincing evidence for an FE4 remake is when people will point to completely unrelated trends in other intelligent systems media as proof that we are definitely getting an FE4 remake. Stuff like, well, there was no banner for FE4, so they're clearly saving that for when the FE4 remake drops next year so that they can also have a Heroes banner come out at the same time. Or the World of Three Houses has crests, and crests are similar to Holy Blood. Therefore, the next game in the series is definitely going to be an FE4 remake. There's islands named Dagda and Avel, and those are characters from FE5, the sequel to FE4, so we're getting the FE4 remake. The internal name for Engage is Iron 18 instead of Iron 17, which means that Iron 17 was a different game, and that means it was probably the FE4 remake, so we're getting the FE4 remake. Not only do these pieces of evidence make huge logical leaps, but they also sometimes are even based on things I would call factually incorrect. One of the big examples of this that comes to mind for me is the idea that Sigurd was more important to the plot of Engage than the other emblems, and therefore this was probably an indication that they intended to have the Fire Emblem 4 remake out when Engage came out, and that's what Iron 17 was, but unless I played a different version of Fire Emblem Engage than the rest of the community, I wouldn't say that this is the case. The only emblem who has any amount of plot relevance is Marth, because it's the first emblem that Alear bonds with, and when Alear loses the 6 emblem rings, they make a big deal of the fact that Marth is missing. When Ivy shows up and gives you the Lucina ring, Alear initially mistakes her for Marth, which is a wink wink nod nod at Awakening, but also meant to represent Alear's longing for Marth. Alear thought of Marth as like a friend, and when we finally get Marth back as the final of the missing emblems recovered, he's the one who recommends Alear gets turned into the 13th emblem, the Fire Emblem. Sigurd, on the other hand, has a single scene where Lumera talks to him before Chapter 3 begins, and that's the extent of his plot relevance. I hear some people talk about how Sigurd was the leader of the emblems in Marth's absence, but I just don't see it. There's one scene where the 8 emblems that Alear and co have access to are all talking to each other to sort of foreshadow the miracle of turning Alear into the 13th emblem, but that doesn't emphasize Sigurd any more than Lyn, Ike, Lucina, etc. They're all just there debating whether or not they should perform this miracle in order to bring Lumera back. To me, the idea that these two scenes, one of which doesn't even emphasize Sigurd, is evidence of an upcoming FE4 remake really feels like people coming to the conclusion an FE4 remake is coming, and then looking for evidence to support that conclusion. I mean, heck, alongside the imagined subtext in the story, we have people measuring out the emblem availability and concluding that Sigurd has the highest availability of every emblem, which is only true if you don't count any of the optional paralogue chapters that get unlocked in his absence, and also doesn't indicate anything about a potential remake. Lucina and Lyn are also available just as long as Sigurd, but I don't hear anyone saying that an Awakening or Blazing Swords remake are guaranteed to come out. Honestly, I don't think Intelligent Systems was trying to subtly communicate to us using the emblem availability of all things. And part of my reason for that is we've been here before. Three Houses had a number of explicit references to Fire Emblem 4, like its villain being named the Flame Emperor, a time skip taking place halfway through the campaign, and the crest system which paralleled the Holy Blood system. Even on a mechanical level, it shared a lot of DNA with the Judgral games, like the arena being a fixed gauntlet that changes every chapter, weapons being able to be repaired in between chapters, and Kanto being even more busted than it is in the Game Boy Advance games. And at the time Three Houses came out, there was a rumor that had been going on for a couple of years of a Genealogy remake being in the works. So a lot of people pointed to these references as a clear example that the remake was real. And perhaps the remake was even supposed to come out before Three Houses, but it had just taken too long to make, so all of these references to FE4 were left over from when FE4 was supposed to have already been remade. But Three Houses has a ton of references to other games in Fire Emblem history. The White Heron Ball, which is how you get your dancer, is a reference to the Heron Lagoos, who are the dancers in the Tellius games. There's a series of mountains referred to as the Ogma Mountains, named after the FE1 character. And in fact, the regalia from FE1 appears as droppable rusted weapons that monsters can give you in random skirmishes. Several characters' last names also appear to be references to earlier FE games, such as Fargus being a reference to the pirate captain from the Blazing Sword. This isn't something that is new to the series or unique to Three Houses. A lot of Fire Emblem games will make references to past entries, and I don't really think there's anything deeper to read into in terms of that. Felicia and Jacob had the Aaron and Samson Heartseal classes, for example. The first map of Fire Emblem 6 is just the map of FE1 but rotated 90 degrees. Of course, the only reason that people clung to these references back then, or look at the availability of Sigurd nowadays, is because they're looking for corroborating evidence for a narrative that they already believe, thanks to something a little bit more convincing than video game patterns. That being anonymous leakers. Since around 2017, there has been an increased frequency of so-called leaks about how the Fire Emblem 4 remake is coming. It'll be out very soon, I promise. And I think the silence from Nintendo disproves basically all of the older ones, because if they were accurate that a Fire Emblem 4 remake was coming out in 2019, I think we would know by now. So instead of focusing on every single anonymous leaker that we've gotten about the FE4 remake, I'm going to hone in on the most recent one. The one that is closely related to the now proven to be accurate Fire Emblem Engage leaks. You see, before Engage was announced, there was someone who leaked a lot of details about the game. They revealed about the emblem rings and how they would be lords from past series. They revealed that Alear was a dragon with red and blue hair. They revealed that the graphics would be significantly improved over Three Houses, and that this would be a collaboration between Intelligent Systems, Koei Tecmo, and Gust. Lastly, they revealed that the game was actually already in a complete state and ready for release, but had been delayed for some reason, and hadn't even been announced yet. Alongside this information, they provided a couple of screenshots of Alear in the Somniel, and most importantly for our purposes, they confirmed that the long-rumored FE4 remake was actually real. Initially, people dismissed this as a very silly fake, similar to Vampire Emblem. However, we eventually learned that Fire Emblem Engage was in fact the next game, and that many of the things they said in the leak turned out to be true, such as summoning emblems from the past and Alear's mother being a dragon. And because this person had gotten all of the information about Engage correct, it only made sense to trust them when they said FE4 remake was coming as well, right? Well, not exactly, because I've actually been lying to you this whole time. All of the information I gave did not come from a single leaker, but is actually two separate leakers that posted on back-to-back days. The first leaker was Emily Rogers, who said that the new Fire Emblem game was not a remake, that it was a collaboration between IS, Koei Tecmo, and Gust, that the graphics would be significantly better than Three Houses, that it was finished for a long time before release, that the new main character was the son or daughter of a dragon, and that emblems would allow you to summon past main characters into your squad. The second leaker was a Reddit user named Miasmadelta, who posted confirming everything Emily said the next day, and added the additional information that the FE4 remake was in the work, while providing some screenshots to back up their claims. And these screenshots are pretty clearly from Engage, or at the very least from a beta build of it. The fact that Miasmadelta was able to post some screenshots that no one else had posted before means at the very least they have some sort of insider source at Intelligent Systems. And while we have no way of knowing for certain, my suspicion is that either they or the person that they had contact with was a playtester for Fire Emblem Engage, which is how they were able to get pictures on sort of a cell phone quality camera. I find it unlikely that they were more heavily involved in Engage's development, since they weren't able to provide any information on their own, and in fact didn't correct the misinformation from Emily Rogers' initial post, because Emily got some stuff wrong herself. Most notably, Koei Tecmo and Gust were not involved in the development of Fire Emblem Engage. They were involved in both Three Houses and Three Hopes, which were developed around the same time as Engage, sort of alongside it, the A team and the B team working on different games at the same time. So someone working much lower on the corporate totem pole might get the impression that Koei was helping with Engage, but in reality they were not. Because of both this and the fact that there's been no news in the last 3 years revolving around an FE4 remake, I find it pretty difficult to believe that the leaks were accurate this time either. Instead, the more likely possibility is either that Miasmadelta added the FE4 notes so that their post could gain traction, or that Miasmadelta or the person that they contacted had seen the Sigurd Paralog, which is a remake of Fire Emblem 4 Chapter 10, or at least a portion of that map, and assumed that that was a Fire Emblem 4 remake, because it's Fire Emblem 4, but in better graphics than on the Switch. I'm not the only person who came to this conclusion. Other doubters and skeptics have expressed that if there was any confusion around an FE4 remake, the Sigurd Paralog probably caused it. But I'll be honest, I think it's equally possible that Miasmadelta just trolled us by saying FE4 remake is coming. Like, at this point, almost every obviously fake Nintendo Direct leak has a Fire Emblem 4 remake section, so It's not that outlandish for other people chasing Reddit clout to use that. Maybe I'm cynical, but I just find it hard to trust random people on the internet without any credentials. Of course, there is one leaker backing up an FE4 remake who does have some amount of credibility, and that is the game's journalist Nate the Hate, who offhandedly mentioned an FE4 remake was coming on a podcast about 3 months ago. He claimed that the Fire Emblem 4 remake would be coming out on the Switch 1 and it would be announced in the February Direct, which actually ended up being the April Direct. But that Direct came and went, and was probably the last Switch 1 Direct we'll ever get, without any mention of a Fire Emblem 4 remake. Of course, Nate the Hate is pretty credible outside of this, so it's very possible that there was plans to reveal the FE4 remake, but something caused it to be delayed. Except for, is Nate the Hate actually reliable? He actually gets a lot of things pretty drastically wrong. He claimed with authority that Starfield would come on PS5, and it did not. He's predicted a couple of Metroid remasters that just didn't happen or happened years later. And even the few things that he correctly guessed, such as the Last of Us remake, he got the dates pretty wildly wrong on as well. I have a link to a Game FAQs thread where someone goes over all of Nate's predictions and how they ended up being incorrect down below if you want to check it out for yourself, but from what I can see, he is not as reliable as people say. It kind of seems like a Nostradamus situation, where you make educated, broad guesses, and when a few of them end up being true, people praise you as some sort of prophet, or in this case, someone with way more insider information than you actually have. And in fact, one thing that is consistent across all of Nate the Hate's predictions that backs up this theory is he hasn't been the first person to rumor a single new game or remaster. Instead, all of his correct predictions are just confirming things that other people have already leaked or rumored. You would think if he actually had some inside sources, he would be the first one to learn about a game every once in a while. Nate the Hate confirming the FE4 remake just feels like the next episode in a pattern of looking at something that's been rumored for a while and trying to cash in to up your reputation in the leakosphere by saying that it's right. I mean, the fact that he said it would be in the February Direct when there wasn't a February Direct, to me just points to this educated guessing. Nintendo almost always has a February Direct. Everyone assumed there would be a February Direct, and then it ended up being in April instead, and nobody was able to predict that. So I'll once again emphasize that I don't trust the words of random strangers on the internet, even ones that have a quote-unquote good leaking reputation. Because on closer inspection, none of them really tend to have a good reputation when it comes to leaks. The audience just focuses on the victories because those are far more exciting than the failures. There is one more argument for an FE4 remake that I actually find more convincing than insider leaks or cryptic tea leaf references in the Fire Emblem games. And that is the fact that a remake of FE4 is just inevitable. These sorts of FE4 remake believers don't think that it's necessarily in active development or believe the things that random leakers say, but instead just follow the logical step that we've gotten a remake of 1, we've gotten a remake of 2, and we've gotten a remake of 3. The next one up is 4, so it's gonna happen soon, right? And there is a certain amount of logic to this, but unfortunately, the sad truth is, not every single game gets remade. Even games in popular franchises sometimes miss out on the remake treatment. Looking just at Nintendo franchises, some of them have good track records when it comes to remakes, such as Pokemon, which has had every generation remade in order starting from the first one, but others are a more mixed bag. The Zelda remakes tend to be popularity rather than chronological order. Metroid, similarly, only has specific games remade, with some of the nicher entries being skipped over by Nintendo, either to be returned to later or just overlooked entirely. And even Mario, the flagship franchise of Nintendo, has a more limited scope when it comes to remakes. The 2D platformers all got remade on the Game Boy Advance, but the 3D ones have been less fortunate, with only 64 getting a complete remake, while Sunshine and Galaxy 1 got a port to the Switch that is no longer available to purchase, and Galaxy 2 got overlooked entirely. The Mario spin-offs fared even stranger. Super Mario RPG and Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door got remakes, but original Paper Mario did not, and a similar thing happened with the Mario and Luigi games, with only Superstar Saga and Bowser's Inside Story getting remakes, skipping over Partners in Time. The other Mario spin-off series, like Kart Party and the sports games, don't get remakes at all. Sometimes they'll have an entry released on Virtual Console, but not always. And when you dive into more niche franchises like Star Fox, Animal Crossing, or Kirby, remakes are almost entirely unheard of. I think there's one Kirby remake, there might be two, but there's none in Animal Crossing and none in Star Fox. My point is, I don't necessarily think Fire Emblem is going to be playing by the same remake rules that Pokemon does. If they're planning on having additional FE remakes, there's no guarantee that the next one up will be 4. In fact, the first 3 Fire Emblem remakes weren't made in order either. 11 and 12 were remakes of 1 and 3, and 15 was a remake of 2. Now there is a good reason for this. The story of Fire Emblem 3 directly follows the story of Fire Emblem 1, whereas Fire Emblem 2 is more of a sequel, interquel, spin-off type thing. It doesn't follow Marth, the main character of the Arcanea games, but does take place on the same world, and the events of Fire Emblem 2 do affect some of the side characters, namely the White Wings and Camus. So, in theory, they could be working their way down the franchise and just want to keep things chronologically straight. This would also possibly mean that Fire Emblem 7 comes out before Fire Emblem 6 Remake, but it's also possible that, much like other franchises, they remake the games based on popularity. And while Sigurd is a very popular character in Japan, and Fire Emblem 4 is a popular game amongst the online entrenched community who knows how to do emulation and translation and that sort of stuff, FE4 isn't the only popular game that could potentially use a remake. Awakening is a huge entry point for the series, and it's over a decade old now, so it's well into remake territory. And Fire Emblem 6 has never been released in an international edition. But Roy being a character who exists in Smash Bros, as well as the story of FE7 being linked to that of FE6, means that this game does have some amount of international appeal that the other Japan-exclusive ones don't. Heck, a similar case could be made for Path of Radiance. It was released to international audiences, but it is incredibly hard to get a hold of nowadays. But thanks to his presence in the Smash Bros series, Ike is very popular. And the Tellius games do tend to have a good reputation from those who've played them. In fact, Fire Emblem 9, due to its ease of use, is often touted as an easy entry point to the series if you have the ability to play it, which a lot of people don't. My point is that while there are reasons to believe the most natural next step would be an FE4 remake, I also think there's a plethora of games who can make just as much of a case, or potentially even more of a case, for being next in line to get remade. But all of this is working under the assumption that we're definitely getting more Fire Emblem remakes. And I'll be honest, I'm not convinced that we are. Just from looking at the 3 modern remakes we did get, it seems reasonable that Intelligent Systems would be hesitant to greenlight another one. Fire Emblem 11 Shadow Dragon sold incredibly poorly. In fact, it was so badly received that the sequel, Fire Emblem 12, was not given an international release, as an attempt at damage control. But this didn't really work. FE12 was also a huge commercial failure. In fact, it was such a failure that Fire Emblem 13 was supposed to be the last game in the franchise. Fire Emblem was just considered a dying series, and they wanted to go out with one big hurrah. Obviously that didn't happen, but the fact that the first 2 remakes since the SNES were nearly franchise-killing flops definitely stuck in Nintendo's memory. So it's honestly surprising that they even attempted another remake with Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia. This was in large part a passion project, and it shows. But unfortunately, passion doesn't pay the bills, and Shadows of Valentia was, to some extent, a commercial failure. It sold 1 million copies, which is impressive, but compared to the 3 million from Fates or 2.3 million from Awakening, as well as the future 4 million from Three Houses, it's just not measuring up. I mean, heck, if we consider Engage's current 1.6 million sales to be a failure, then we kind of have to say the same about Shadows of Valentia. Sure, it was on a less successful console, and the Fire Emblem fanbase has grown significantly since Three Houses came out, so those are definitely factors to SOV not doing as well. And Gaiden itself is a game with a lot of eccentricities that separate it from modern Fire Emblem. So it does make sense to an extent that not as many people were going to be attracted to it. But the franchise's 3 biggest failures across 2 consoles, all being remakes, also definitely left a sour taste in Nintendo's mouth. And while I don't have any evidence of this, I do suspect that there was at least a tentative plan to make the Fire Emblem Echoes series into a series of remakes that was eventually scrapped. The main thing that makes me think this is giving a game 2 subtitles feels kind of weird. I know some other series do it, and in fact Fire Emblem 12 technically has 2 subtitles if you translate it to English, but the Echoes: Shadows of Valentia really feels like it's setting up for Echoes: Dawn of Judgrol, Echoes: Memories of Delius, etc., etc. But the fact that over the past 8 years they haven't done anything with the Echoes subtitle, as well as Celica being named the Emblem of Echoes, therefore forever associating the word Echoes with Valentia as opposed to remakes in general, I feel like Echoes are just not happening. I could be wrong. Like I said, I don't have any evidence for this. I'm doing the same sort of scrying that I criticized earlier in the video, but it's just the inkling that I get around the theoretical Echoes series of remakes. And even if I am incorrect and they are planning additional remakes, I don't think it would be unreasonable for Nintendo or IS to want to remake a safer bet. Yes, there's demand for the FE4 remake in the hardcore dedicated fans, but more casual viewers who aren't willing to watch a 20-minute video breaking down the rumors of a game that we don't even know exists are unlikely to have heard of Sigurd outside of him being that dude from Engage. That might be enough to attract some of them, but others are gonna be turned off by a lot of the unique mechanics that FE4 has. And I don't want them to change those mechanics because I think that stuff like the pawn shop and the pursuit system are part of what makes FE4 so great. But at the same time, if you want to have a remake that you don't think is going to be a financial flop, something like an Awakening remake, the Tellius games, or one of the Game Boy Advance games would be a much safer bet. While every Fire Emblem is somewhat experimental and they're all going to be pretty different from each other, I think that these games resemble modern Fire Emblem a bit more than Fire Emblem 4 would. That being said, I am by no means against the idea of a Fire Emblem 4 remake. If it were announced tomorrow and this video were proved to be entirely incorrect and pointless, I would still be happy because I would get to play a more modernized version of Genealogy of the Holy War. I think that there are a lot of areas where you could improve Genealogy. In particular, the maps are kind of slow and the enemy formations are pretty boring, so an added hard mode similar to what they did in SOV would be a welcome change. And if they integrated the substitutes or some of the Thracia characters into the story, that would also be really cool. I mean, heck, I would just love to see Arvid and Sigurd interact with voice acting. I mean, okay, just close your eyes and picture this. The next Nintendo Direct happens, there's no mention of Fire Emblem anywhere, and then at the end the speaker says, and now we have one more thing. The screen fades to black, and on screen come the words, for holiday 2025, we have a generational story. Cut to a close-up of a man with blue hair. Generic anime features, but as it zooms out, it becomes incredibly clear this is Sigurd. He's standing there on his horse, and as we zoom further out, it's revealed that his horse is not in the middle of a random field, but actually inside of a building. You're able to fully walk around that building, which is a record studio in Tokyo, because Sigurd is the main Mirage for the protagonist of Tokyo Mirage Sessions 2, which is a generational story because all of the protagonists of Tokyo Mirage Sessions 2 are going to be the children of the protagonists of Tokyo Mirage Sessions 1. I mean, come on, that would be so fucking funny. Intelligent Systems has the opportunity to troll 1 million people. Tell me you don't want to see that. Tell me you don't want to see that. I think that would be amazing. Oh well, a girl can dream. Longtime viewers of the channel might recognize that I made a video similar to this a couple of years ago. That video is old and bad. It's not only outdated, but I was a lot worse at editing and audio mixing when I recorded it, and there's a large portion of the video that is just silent now because it had to be edited thanks to a copyright claim. So this serves as the Switch 2 upgrade pack, but I won't charge you $20 for it. Instead, it's entirely funded by my patrons, who I should thank. So, thank you to Andu, Len, Gameboo, Kurosa, Fyrant, Your Doctor, Seren Galaxy, Guiji555, Smaz Ruby, Zycrom, Robin D, Alenby, Hound Dogs, Girl Boss, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Mira McLean, Jaden, Reflect, Bethany, Calamity Callie, Theythom, A Clever Username of Lies, Jackson Mahin, Kevin Hart Clawpose, Tailored Muffin, Electric Giga, Erica Ford, YLO1, George Grenville the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Thick Molder, Arvis, Crispy Matthews, Floahay, Faulty Videos, Lyra, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Just Riley, Anna Cabana, Some Trades, The Daily Fugle, Faye, Magic Bite, Sardonic Muse, Dysike, Chris, Root Beer Pants, Queen Elizam, Aerith Emblem, Adele, Control Daegis, Roman Cormancic, Nick Knack Hammersmack, SUP, Caius Cole, Histiclop, Bree, Punchfighter Champion, Eggman, Maxine the Vampire Queen, Henry Johnson, Dragonback Lancer, and Carrier Has Left. My ability to make absurd and stupid videos about games that haven't even been announced yet entirely comes from y'all, so thank you so much. If you're interested in funding equally stupid things, there's a link to my Patreon below, but subscribing, commenting, all that stuff that helps out in the algorithm is also a free way to support me. And it's especially appreciated since YouTube recently made a change to their algorithm that severely impacts creators around my size or smaller. But regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.